Good morning. Can you hear me? Just checking the...
So, good morning, and welcome back to our 2 days workshop. As I had the chance to mention yesterday, after a first day where the idea was to introduce the concepts and the idea and how the system dynamics methodology can be used in certain contexts, today we will delve a little bit more into the details of the methodology together with our guest speaker Paul Davidsen here. First of all, Paul, thanks for being here with us today. It's always a pleasure to see you. And surely Paul will lead us through the meadows of the methodology, and will help us build for those who are, of course, learning and trying to understand how to delve into the details of the methodology, some models. And I would say some interesting models which are always full of insights, also for those who know about system dynamics. We will have first a general introduction to system dynamics and some examples. And I will leave this to Paul to describe what he will do today. Then, of course, we will have our coffee break, which is scheduled to be held at 11. We will start back at 11:30 with a presentation of cases by building a model, analyzing results, communicating insights through systems archetypes. Then we will have our lunch scheduled at 1. And we will get back to work at 2 o'clock with a hands-on session. So actually, as we're not that many, probably we can arrange to have the hands-on session directly into this room, but we can decide this later, because we also have another room available, and we can move into the other room if it's more comfortable to work with the laptops. I'm gonna now check how many we are and if we can fit into the other room altogether. As you know, that session was scheduled to be held not for students, but there are not so many students actually, so we should be able to fit into that room. We will have also another coffee break in the afternoon around 3:30, and the workshop will end at with some final remarks at 5:30 and some questions. So I will leave it suddenly to Paul. Paul, thanks. I see a nice picture here.
Yes.
And so it's up to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano. I am delighted to be here. This is going to be a one-day session, which is pretty crazy, right? You know, you'll be so tired of this voice and what I have to say, and I'm going to repeat myself over and over again, so we'll see. Some of you have been to my lectures previously, and although I will be saying the same thing as I've said then, and that's a comfort, you know, the message is the same. Hopefully it'll be done in a more elegant and a better way than I've done before, ever done before. So you might see some improvements, at least in the presentations. We'll see. But some of the slides you'll seen before, and system dynamics is very often so that you need to revisit and revisit and revisit the concepts, and you dig deeper and deeper. So it's like a spiral learning process. At least that's been the way it has been for me. So today, the way I've been thinking about this is that I will give a introductory presentation. It will be a relatively quick presentation because there are fairly many slides. And then many of the issues that I'm addressing there will be revisited in two case studies that I will show you. One is built around the traditional market growth model that some of you are familiar with, and the other one around, but a modification of the inventory workforce model, which is also one of the classical system dynamics models. The last one will also be the topic of this afternoon's session, where we're going to actually build the model and analyze it in more detail. Hopefully, we will be able to keep within the time limits, and I'll just be very tough with myself and say enough is enough once the deadlines are there, so that you can be looking forward to the coffee breaks and the lunch. So let me just start, and the first lecture this morning is, it may look fairly simple, but it actually goes fairly deep. It addresses some of the most fundamental issues that we're struggling with in system dynamics, and hopefully presented in such a way that you grasp the main content. If you have any questions or comments during the lecture, welcome to raise your hand, and then we'll address that. If this goes a little bit fast, as I said, then we'll revisit this during the entire day, these issues. So I think there are ample opportunities to understand what I'm saying if you don't get it the first time around. But hopefully you do. The picture you see on the screen here is a fairly famous picture, and you may all understand who this is, Jay Forrester, the founder of our field. And I'm putting it up there and to say that this is a guy, the field originates in a sense from the Midwest, and from a situation where Jay Forrester was out there on the farm ranching, and he was in control, as you can see. And since then, he has been in control. System dynamics originates from control theory, and he's, in this case, regulating the horse. He's making the horse do what he wants it to do, and probably also the photographer. Since then, Jay Forrester, having left farming and having done a lot of engineering on his farm, building windmills and so on and so forth, went to MIT, was there in the servo mechanics lab, developed a number of devices. He then went on to build the first reliable electronic computer in the world, Win1, which was used later on in the SAGE project, which was a big project on surveying the North American airspace for incoming rockets and airplanes using computers. And because he was able to complete these two major projects, the engineering project, on time and on budget, he was considered to be quite a manager. So that when Sloan School of Management was established, he was called to teach there. And what he did was pretty original. He took his control theory, servo mechanics background, and he brought it into management. And he was using that to understand by modeling and simulation some of the businesses in the Boston area, the urban dynamics of the United States, the world dynamics as understood by many people, for instance, people from the Club of Rome. Since we are in Rome, that should be mentioned. And then teaching this to a large cohort of students, these students went all over the world, partly in the private sector and partly in the public sector and partly in the academic sector, to spread the word of system dynamics. And although it's been a very slow growth, that doesn't mean that we're not growing. In fact, we are. And I think there is, as we heard yesterday, a growing concern about a number of issues that are systemic of nature and require systemic solutions. So I think the time is getting more and more ripe for the field of system dynamics. We need to rise to the occasion and develop the methods, the techniques, and the tools that are required for understanding that world. So what I'll do now is to address some of the basic concepts in system dynamics, and I might spin your head around a couple of times because some of the examples are full of feedback loops and they require that you have full attention. So that's why we're presenting this in the morning, and then after the coffee break and lunch break, we'll see. I'll spell it out in more detail so that you can follow me in small steps, and that'll be easier in many ways. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the principles of system dynamics modeling and analysis for managerial purposes. And you do have the slideshow. This slideshow is copied as it is in your folder, so you should be able to take notes there and revisit the slideshow. I think, is it also posted on the web, right? Yep. Yeah, good. And so will the other presentations I have. They partly are and partly will new versions be posted there. So don't worry about not having enough time to digest all the material right now. So system dynamics can be used in a number of contexts, and the way we often do is to look at system dynamics as a phenomenal tool to do knowledge elicitation. In other words, to gather information and to map information onto a single place, namely a system dynamics model. We do that in very many ways, and perhaps most well known is in group model building, where we have experts from various fields and stakeholders that come together and talk about a particular issue, a particular problem that they want to address, and then we as facilitators and modelers are mapping the ideas and the knowledge that we get from these experts onto one and the same platform, namely this model. That allows us gradually to get a feeling for what kind of problem we're facing. In other words, it's a tool for problem identification, and later on when we develop policies to address those problems for problem solving. Then, having sort of solved the problem in the form of formulating a policy, we have to be modest and say that very often those policies are not ideal. They may not be exactly what we need. And therefore, rather than just do a one-shot attempt at solving a problem, we very often have to revisit the issue. And that's something that our clients are not always aware of. They think you've done a one-time thing and that's it. But in many cases, I would see the system dynamics model as a repository of the knowledge that we have right now. But that knowledge may develop, and therefore the model should also be developing over time. So the minute you see that the model is saying one thing and reality goes in a different direction, I would claim that there is nothing wrong about reality. There's something wrong about our model, right? So in other words, what we need to do is then revisit our model and say what was wrong about the concept that we had of reality, and then make corrections for that. And I think some of the most successful uses of system dynamics are the ones where you see the model develop over time. In other words, see the system dynamics models as seen as a part of or vital component in organizational learning, where what you have learned is mapped onto this model, and the understanding of our reality is improving over time. So I think that using a system dynamics model continuously for the purpose of shaping our decision making, that is designing policies and redesigning policies based on new knowledge, is an important property of system dynamics. The model shouldn't just be left there and put in a vault and be seen as a sacred thing. It should be a live component in your organizational development. And then, of course, knowledge dissemination. It should not only be the people who are developing the model that know about or that has this knowledge. It should be disseminated throughout your organization, so other people should get to know it. And there are many ways of doing that. One is, and that's proven pretty successful, one is to develop interactive learning environment based on the system dynamics model that you had, you developed, just like pilots are put into a flight simulator to learn about their airplane and to explore the properties of that airplane. You should do the same with organizations. You should teach people to know about the organization and its context, the market, and so on and so forth, using these models. Okay, so the typical thing in system dynamics is that we distinguish between events, what hits the headlines and the newspapers and television, the behavior, the underlying behavior that leads to these events, and the underlying structure that governs that behavior and creates that behavior. So very often we look at the events as symptoms, the behavior is dynamics, things that develop over time, and the structure as the underlying causes or mechanism that creates this behavior. Now, decision making per se is very often oriented towards the event and the behavior. It is a reactive mode of making decisions based on policies, decision rules that you have developed. And when a pilot is piloting an airplane, he's reacting to what's happening in the environment, and with the knowledge, with the procedures, policies that are in place, he is able to manage this airplane, very often also automatically through autopilots. And then the question is, where is our place? And our place is in this relationship between structure and behavior that I also talked about yesterday, namely in designing policies that are based on an understanding of how these mechanisms, how this structure is working to create the kind of behavior that we are observing that leads to the events eventually. So in other words, policy design is the foundation for decision making, and that's a relationship between these two levels. Decision making takes place all the time. Policy design should also take place more or less all the time, but maybe with a slower pace and based on an understanding of a structure that hopefully doesn't change all the time. So in other words, we're going to concentrate on the policy design issue. And in an organization such as a business, you have a lot of policies. So for instance, you have a sales policy, you have a marketing policy, you have an acquisition policy, you have a personnel policy, you have a financial policy, you have an inventory policy, you have a production policy, you have a personnel policy. Okay, and in the government, I don't want to mention all the policies that are in place there, but you can just look at the various ministries and you'll find out, there are policies for all kinds of policy arenas. And the typical thing is that you have a manager who sees to it, hopefully, that these policies are coming through. The problem, both in government and in organizations, is that these policies are not very well balanced very often, right? So here's a typical example. You have a company and it hasn't been performing very well. The sales have been sluggish, and now a new manager, this guy is coming in. And you know, he wants to turn the whole thing around. So what is he doing? He's going in there and doing an enormous sales effort. And sales are flourishing. And then the organization gets very frustrated because we don't have finished goods. We can't sell it right now. We're in trouble here. And well, can't you produce it? We don't have raw material. And we certainly don't have the people required for that. So this guy is creating problems for the organization, even though it was a very good intent. What this leads to is, of course, enormous lead times. You're not able to deliver to the customer. You develop a reputation in the market that says, this company can't deliver, so we go to somewhere else. And it's his fault, right? He did it to us. So in other words, if you have a policy that is not well tuned with the production policy, with the acquisition policy, with the raw material policy, and so on and so forth, you may be in the danger of destroying the company. And we don't want that. So in other words, what we do in system dynamics is to try to balance these policies. So that is strategy development. We develop a strategy which consists of a lot of well-balanced policies that work well together. And these policies are then governing the decision-making within each of the parts of the organization. Now, that's my view of this. And what it means is that we need, in a system dynamics effort, very often to be fairly comprehensive. And we should not fare going into from one arena, from one policy area to another one, to cross disciplinary boundaries, organizational boundaries, sectorial boundaries, and so on and so forth. We should just pursue the causal relationships, which may bring us from one field to the other, from one policy arena to another one. And that is because the problems we're facing are very often interdisciplinary and intersectorial. So we'll get back to that. So in other words, to summarize, what we do is to identify a problem or describe a problem by looking at problematic behavior. We want to identify the underlying structure that governs that behavior, that creates that behavior. We want to identify a new structure. We want to find new ways of doing things so that hopefully that generates the goal behavior, the desired behavior we have. In other words, in this case, a more smooth behavior. And of course, all of this is a hypothesis and development and hypothesis testing. So we use a scientific approach both in finding a model that explains current behavior, the problem behavior, and finding policies or modifications of that structure that generates a better behavior. And it would be nice if we just push a button on a computer and say optimize the fit between reality and our model, or push a button and say find the optimal policy. In nonlinear feedback systems, unfortunately, that's not the way it works. Very often we have to develop an intuition about what's going on out there to explain what's going on, and we have to develop an intuition based on an understanding of our model, of where we can intervene, how we can intervene, what it costs to intervene, and how balanced those interventions should be in order to solve our problem. So I said that system dynamics is a multi-oriented, a problem-oriented, multidisciplinary or multi-sectorial approach. And it very often covers a lot of different subjects. So my favorite example is that you're in a Norwegian fjord. You know what a fjord is, right? So mountainsides that come down like this, and then there is a very deep fjord. And you have farmers along that fjord. Those farmers typically have one good neighbor and one bad neighbor. I'm sure this is true all over the world. You have a good neighbor and a bad neighbor. So there is this family who's always been very progressive, and they find out that farming is, it's not a sustainable activity here. So we need to do some fish farming in the fjord. So they develop a fish industry. And of course, the bad neighbor has for 300 years been extremely envious about this very progressive family and always created problems for them, all kinds of stuff. So also this time. So what they do is then to, put too much manure on their fields, and that runs off into the fjord and creates major problems for the fish farming, right? And they do so for 3 years until the entrepreneurial neighbor says, well, you got to do something about it. And so let's look at the entire problem here. It deals with physics, right? Runoff. It deals with biology, how the fish is reacting. It deals with economics. It deals with law. It deals with, and you can, one subject after the other you can bring in. That's what I was going to say, that, eventually this is an anthropological issue. The feud has been going on for 300 years. So now we come there and think we can fix it with, some lawyers or something. Well, it's not as easy as that. So in other words, this shows you that, yes, there is a cultural issue here as well. And much of this is difficult to capture in a system dynamics model. But, having a discussion about this conflict over such a model might lose up some issues that have not been identified before. For instance, the entrepreneurial neighbor could begin to invite the other neighbor to be part of this activity. And maybe the son of that neighbor says, well, father, it's not too bad. Maybe we should do the same, typically problems, and that's my key issue here, are very interdisciplinary. Problems do not respect the boundaries we have in universities and in administrative units. So the question is, what is then system dynamics? Well, system dynamics is to identify, understand, and utilize this relationship between structure and behavior in complex dynamic systems. To recognize that the structure creates a behavior, and that the behavior feeds back through what you could originally perhaps look at as the parameters that determines the relative importance of the structures that are there. In other words, it sort of changes the relative importance of structural components, and in a simple manner we can say it creates a new structure. Some structural elements are no longer important. Other structural elements are key importance in explaining new behavior. So we exemplified that yesterday, and we'll go into other examples today. Now, what I will do right now is to address the issue of complexity. So there are many words and many concepts of complexity. The ones that I will address here are accumulation processes, which creates delays, feedback, and nonlinearities. And I think it is, then of course we have uncertainty, and in many cases we can talk about fuzziness. So there are many of these additional properties of such systems that we could address. And there are tools to do that as well. I will first concentrate on accumulation processes or latencies, things that take time. Now, there are two kinds of relationship in system dynamics models, of course, as there are in any differential equation systems, if you want to be a mathematician. Those are the instantaneous causalities, things that are happening at an instance. In other words, that one variable immediately influences another one. And very often these are by definition. I mean, we develop concepts such that you have an income and you have an expenditure, and the net profit is one minus the other one. So if one changes, the profit changes as well. Now, the most important ones that create the dynamics that we see are the causalities that play out over time. And those are captured in the relationship between structure and between flow rates and stock levels. And I will try to explain very simply why time matters here. So let's assume that in a rate, we've had a constant rate, and then suddenly we just increase the rate. You open the faucet of a bathtub or whatever, and my question is, if you see here, this is what happens in the stock that accumulates, whatever water, money, personnel you have in the stock. And my question is, what happens instantaneously? What happens right now at this instance when you've opened the faucet? Well, there is nothing that happens, right? There is absolutely nothing, nada. So in other words, this means that you have to let time pass for anything to happen. In other words, you need the help of time. And can you hear the delay in this? Can you hear that there is a process that takes time? Okay, so what happens then is, of course, that if you have a flow rate that increases from 0 up to a maximum, which leads to a maximum increase in the stock level, and then comes down again towards 0 again, which leads to still an increase, but a slowing increase. The development over time looks like this. So you have an increasing, so the stock is increasing increasingly, and then the stock is increasing decreasingly, right? So here's an increase and then a decrease in the flow. And that is then translated or transformed into that kind of development in the stock. And if we continue this, let me see if I can do that. If we continue this, then we start draining the stock, so we have a negative flow rate. And first we drain it very slowly. Then here we drain it maximally, so the stock level falls maximally fast. And then it slows down again as the rate approaches 0. So in other words, what we have now is a stock level that decreases increasingly, and then it continues to decrease decreasingly. The decreasingly and increasingly is the second derivative, right? It is how the change takes place. If we continue like this and project the flow rate over on the level, stock level, then you will see that the peaks in the flow rate becomes 90 degrees if you want, prior to the peak in the stock level. So here you begin to get a feeling for what it means that a flow rate integrating into a stock level constitutes a delay. And that's why when we model delays, we use stocks and flows. And when we have stocks and flows in our model, we implicitly do have delays. And then we can't just say that A influences B. When A goes up, then B goes down or goes up. We have to say, and over time, this leads to a change in the stock level, which, so you always have to pause when you talk about the system at the moment when you go from a flow rate to a stock level. This is what brings the system forward in time. This is where the integration over time takes place. If all the relationships, causal relationships, had been instantaneous, you would have been circulating at the same time around the system, all the loops in the system. And the way I often explain this is, if this is a table that constitutes a time, a particular time, and time goes up to the sky here, so it progresses this way. then, A influences B, which influences D, which influences C, and now we come to an integration. Eventually, we'll increase D, which will influence A, which will influence B, and so on and so forth. And every time you come to an integration, a relationship that takes time, you progress in time. So that's why these relationships between flow rates and stock levels are so fundamental in dynamic systems. They constitute those dynamics. Now, accumulations distribute the form and the effects of a change across a system that is in space over time. So let me give you an example of that. Let's suppose that, you have a company and you have an inventory, and you ship from that inventory. And of course, you need a production to fuel the inventory. In order to do that, you need a capacity to do so. In this case, it's manpower. So you hire and train people, assimilate them into the workforce, which is what we saw yesterday. And there is an attrition rate, so some people are leaving the company. In order to do that, you need trainers, right? You need an educational component in there, and that gives you, the capacity of that gives you the rate at which you can hire and train people and assimilate them into the workforce. And of course, the training capacity may be increased or decreased, as you see at the top level here. So now, technically speaking, we are not talking about just a stock. We're talking about the change in that stock, and not only just that stock. So that's the first derivative. We go into the second derivative. So if you look at a company, very often you have the second and third and fourth derivative. You're trying to manage the system very indirectly often, and that's not a very easy thing to do. I'll create an analogy very soon to that. Well, there is a lady here who's responsible for the training effort in this company. And what she sees is that when the guy responsible for sales is saying we don't have enough inventory, she realizes that we need more manpower and well-trained manpower. The way she boosts the training effort is the following way. She then takes as you saw yesterday, the experienced engineers and put them into a training capacity, and therefore boosts the training so that over time the manpower will increase. In the meantime, what will happen is that she will drain the manpower. She will take out manpower. How do you think the guy down here is reacting to that? Is he going to be happy about it? No, you can see he's not happy, because the production rate goes down, intermittently at least. But he just sees that it goes down. This is not what I said, he says to top management. This is not what I said. I want more. I don't want less. So in other words, what he does then is become furious. And of course, he sends feedback. So now he calls. It's the first time he talks to this lady. Oh, you're the manager of the training session here. Well, listen. Yeah. And then, and then she is then trying to communicate the following, that yes, but the fastest way you can get trained personnel is by having the best trainers that really knows the system. So we need, for a short period of time, to take those out of production, train them, use them as trainers, get more people in, and then eventually you will have a much better staff next time around. You say short period of time, he says, how short? I need this, I need to satisfy the customers tomorrow. So here we see the tension between the two. One of the reasons for this tension is that maybe you're responsible for a little part of the organization here that don't see the big picture, don't see the delays in building up the capacity that you need in order to be better off next time around. And this is also an example, and a very typical example of better before worse or worse before better. In this case, worse before better. You are worse off for a period of time. You need to suffer because we're aiming at something much better next time around. Now the guy down here, of course, it's difficult to convince him that this happens. So, but that's the responsibility very often of system dynamicists, to lay out the whole picture. and to make people understand that. So multiple accumulations like this introduce intransparency in the system. It's difficult to see through the system, and that leads very often to a focus on short-term problems. I need to solve my problem here and now, and my little problem, and then you ignore the long-term benefits of being a little bit patient or suffering a little bit in the short run. Or focus on short-term benefits. You know, I want to spend as much as possible right now, while ignoring the long-term, often called side effects of doing that. I need to go out and smoke now. I don't care about what happens in 30 years. Is this a alarm?
No, nothing serious.
It probably tells me that I should take a break, right? Well, I'm not. So in other words, very often I talk about this as if driving a car. Now, the example you see here doesn't look like car driving, but it is an example of the kind of issue that a manager is facing. In this case, what you see is that you have an expectation about demand that is built up as a consequence of market demand. So the market demand creates an expectation, and we'll see that model today in one of the examples that we have, which then leads to two things. It leads to a building of capacity in the form of capital and the building of capacity in the form of personnel. And here you see, you know, balanced policies, right? You don't need personnel when you don't have capital. You don't need capital when you don't have personnel. So we need to build up the personnel policy and the capital acquisition policy needs to be somehow balanced in tune. Those two, the two capacities leads to production, which leads to a build-up over time. So we now got a lot of time constants here that determines how the system develops, and inventory. And the inventory then makes you ready for shipments, right? Which is to satisfy the demand. Now, because of all the delays and the complexities here, this is just like driving a car, but not just any car. And now you'll understand why cars are so phenomenally well designed. Suppose that you have a car which when you turn the steering wheel to the right, it takes 12 seconds before the car reacts. And then when you do it the other way, it takes about 8 seconds. And then when you pull the brake, it takes 24 seconds before the car starts breaking down, and then or stopping, and then the accelerator works fortunately after 4 seconds, so that's not too bad. If you do the shift, then it takes, you know, different time delays depending on whether you go up or down and so on and so forth. And by the way, the mirror is such that you hardly see what's happened before because it's broken, and the windshield is very muddy, so you hardly see what's happening in the future here, right? Now, imagine driving such a car. Takes an enormous amount of training. Well, managers are facing exactly that. You know, if I push this button, it takes a long time for things to happen. If I push this, it'll happen immediately. If I talk to this guy, he reacts now, and then, you know, when I talk to this guy, I know it'll take forever for him to react. You know, so in other words, there are lots of delays, and there are lots of avenues through which my signals are traveling through the system. And the issue is that I need for this signal to meet that signal at the right time, at the right place. How do I accomplish that? If you look at a hospital, for instance, there are lots of logistics happening there. You need, in order for a patient to be treated, you need the patient there. And by the way, in the right room, so you need the room. You need the right equipment in that room. You need a doctor there, you need a nurse there, you need papers there, and the computer should be working. You know, can you imagine? Everything needs to be at this place at the right time. And if not, the doctor is just walking out again and say, you know, I can't work here because, you know, I don't have the right equipment. I don't even have the patient. Where is the patient, right? So in other words, what we need to do is to create a system of coordination that takes into consideration the kinds of delays that we're talking about here. Okay, so why don't we take a 2-3 minutes break? Just stretch your legs and, you know, revigorate yourself, and then we will address, continue a little bit with delays, not very much, and then we'll address feedback and nonlinearities. 2 or 3 minutes, just, you know.
All right. Everybody stand up and raise your hand and put them down.